Alrighty, folks, we're going to go ahead and begin the afternoon session. So thanks all for coming on back. So I want to invite Amy up here. So we're going to do kind of a joint Q&A session. We have Amy and David coming up to speak about IPv4 addresses and the market and a post run-out world, of course. And what we're going to do is we're going to have Amy give her talk, and I have David give his talk, and then afterwards we're going to invite them both up for a joint Q&A. So get your questions ready and take it away, Amy. Thanks.
All right. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Amy Potter. I'm the Vice President of Hilco Streambank, and I run our IP address brokerage. A little background on me, for those of you that don't know me. People always ask how I got into such a weird job. I went to law school where I specialized in intellectual property, but by the time I graduated, I wasn't really interested in practicing. So I found my company, which is a boutique investment bank that specializes in intellectual property and other intangible assets. We got into the IP address market shortly after the very first large publicly known sale of IP addresses, because we were handling asset sales for the bankruptcy estates of Borders and Circuit City. And it turned out that they had IP addresses as well, so we sold those and the business just developed from there. My perspective with a legal background and my organization's perspective as handling other types of asset sales has really colored the way that we've approached the IP address market. When I first started coming to conferences and handling all of these transactions, there was a lot of stigma attached to the IP address market, and I think it was really negative for everyone involved. A lot of people looked at what was going on and thought that all of the players involved were doing these very sketchy things, and all of these sales were these underground gray market sales, and so they didn't engage in the same sort of diligence and responsible behavior that you do with other types of asset purchases. So really, if there's one thing that I'd like everyone to take from this talk, is that you really need to treat this type of a sale like you would any other major purchase that you are engaging in for your company. Handle it responsibly, do your diligence, and work with people that you trust. So I'll start out with a little background on the IP address market, or why you now have to pay for something that was free. So traditionally, the primary source for IP addresses were the regional internet registries and their predecessors. In the very early days of the internet, you got one of three sizes of IP address blocks. You either received 256 addresses, 65,000, or 16.7 million. At the same time, the amount of evidence that was required to receive a block of IP addresses was much less than it is today. So there were tons of organizations that got much more space than they actually needed, as well as a handful of organizations that never even used the space that was handed to them. With only 4.3 billion IPv4 addresses and a growing internet, this became more and more of a problem as exhaustion progressed. At this point, a few years ago, back in 2009, Aaron stepped in and implemented their first transfer policy that allowed organizations that had excess space to transfer that to recipients that actually needed it. And this helped to address this sort of misallocation problem that had arisen back in the 90s. And from there, the market continued to progress. In the early days of the market, Aaron and the other RIRs still had some free pools of space that they were handing out. You'll be able to see in a couple of slides the interesting impact that has had on pricing. But unfortunately, as of September of 2015, Aaron no longer has a free pool of address space, so now you have to pay for it. So currently, if you don't want to pay for it, you can take your chances on Aaron's waiting list. So you apply to Aaron the same way you would have previously to receive space directly from Aaron, and they'll put you on their waiting list. And as space is returned to them, if they get any additional allocations from IANA, they will fulfill those requests based on what they have at the time. When I was putting this together a week or two ago, the waiting list was 392 requests long. The oldest request was from July of 2015. Those were all /20s and larger. For the /24s, the oldest one has been waiting since October of 2015. So don't apply for the waiting list expecting to get that space right away. Something else to keep in mind if you do decide to go down that route is that currently when you apply for the waiting list, you provide Aaron with a 3-month justification window. If you later decide you want to move on to the transfer market, you're allowed to transfer a 24-month amount of space, so you might want to provide them with that justification information from the beginning so that you don't have to go back and do that over again. So here you can see the number of V4 delegations that Aaron has given out in 2016. There was a chunk of them in May when Aaron had a little bit of space returned to them. But for the most part, you're stuck sitting around waiting on the waiting list. In contrast, here are the transfers that have been occurring at the same time. So the transfer market is really where you're stuck getting your space now in this region. So what I want to talk to you guys today about are some best practices for participating in that market. Making sure that you are going about this in a responsible way so that you don't end up putting out money for something that you never receive or falling into some of the problems that we've seen less responsible organizations fall into in the past. So as a starting point, what you need to do is just assess your situation. How much space do you need as an organization? There are two sort of ways to look at this. You can look at how much space you anticipate needing of V4 space ever over time, or how much you can qualify for right now with Aaron. Because pricing does fluctuate quite a bit and continues to increase, a lot of organizations that have the funds are choosing to engage in futures contracts where they purchase as much space as they anticipate needing over, say, the next 5 years, and then transferring it to their Aaron account over time as they're able to qualify to receive that space. If you're not interested in engaging in that long of a contract and you want to just get the space you can qualify for now, you can purchase space and just immediately transfer that 24-month supply right away. That's really the simplest way to go about doing that. Something to keep in mind that's always a really good idea is you can apply for pre-approval with Aaron. You provide them all of the justification information that you normally would during the transfer process ahead of time, and then you'll have a document from Aaron saying that you are pre-approved for this amount of space, and that's really great information to have going forward when you are seeking out a seller of space and entering into that contract, so you don't get stuck in a situation mid-transaction where it turns out you're not able to qualify for as much space as you had planned, and you end up wasting a lot of people's time. And depending on how you had your contract structured, you might end up losing the space that you had purchased with that contract and have to go back out onto the market, at which point prices might be higher than when you first started out. So it's always a really good idea to get your ducks in a row ahead of time, apply for pre-approval, and then you can make a decision from there. Do I want to get just the amount of space I pre-approval for? Do I want to get a larger amount of space and enter into a futures contract and do it that way? Another thing that you need to keep in mind is your timeline. This isn't something that you just purchase and get tomorrow or a week from now. Oftentimes there are contract negotiations that take a while. The transfer itself can take a while. So you need to start planning earlier than you necessarily would think you do, just so that you have enough time and so you're not stuck where your network needs the space immediately and you don't have it. So you want to get started as early as possible and communicate your timing needs to the other party so that everyone's able to move as quickly as possible to get you what you need. So the next issue is how much should you budget? The IPv4 market is difficult because there's not a ton of transparency out there. One thing I would caution everyone about is when you read these news articles telling you that there are addresses out there selling for $100 per address, I've never seen addresses sell for that expensive. I've never seen a news article that accurately quotes the price of a sale that wasn't listed in a public document like a bankruptcy estate sale. So be careful looking at news publications for that sort of thing. I'd suggest that you reach out to a number of different brokers and sellers to get a good idea of pricing that's available. Because there's so little transparency, sometimes you see a lot of fluctuation between one seller and another, and so it's just great to have as much information as possible moving forward. Here I've put together some charts based on our private sales as well as publicly recorded sale prices in bankruptcy bankruptcy sales. So these are all sales that I can actually confirm the price of. You can see some interesting trends that have happened over time. Starting back in 2011, prices actually were higher, than they started to drop. As I mentioned, Aaron had not reached exhaustion when the market first opened up. And so prices continued to drop because people were able to get the space for free and there weren't as many people participating. You can see right around in 2015 was when Aaron hit exhaustion and prices started to increase from there. So I have a /24, a 20, a 16, and then I sort of grouped /15 plus into its own category here. And the 24s are the most expensive per address. For the most part, it's sort of like Costco. The more of something you buy, the better price per unit. However, a recent trend has started to develop with the very large blocks. So if you're looking for a 24 or something smaller, yes, you're going to pay a higher price per unit. But then once you start getting to /16s and larger, we're starting to see an interesting trend where prices are starting to pick back up from there on a per unit basis because there are so few large contiguous blocks of space available. One thing that new entrants to the market tend to be surprised by is there's really not as much space out there as you might think just looking at registry information, because there are a lot of large buyers that have entered into futures contracts. So even though there is, a /8 or, another very large block registered to one organization, they might have already sold the rights to that space to someone else and it's not out there on the market. So you do need to do quite a bit of research going in, figuring out your budget and figuring out what space is available to you before you start moving forward with a transaction. Another thing you need to be aware of are the regional internet registry policies. So currently, ARIN, RIPE, and APNIC, so the North American, the European, and the Asia Pacific regional internet registries all have transfer policies in place where you can transfer within the region and also between each of the other regions. But each of them have slightly different policies that you need to meet in order to qualify to receive a transfer of that registration into their registry. Within ARIN, there are two sides to it. There's a backwards looking side where you need to show that you've utilized 80% of the blocks already assigned to you within ARIN. And then you also need to show a 24-month plan for how you're going to be able to use the space that's being transferred to you. One thing to keep in mind within ARIN when you're purchasing space from an ARIN seller is that ARIN does have a 1-year hold period. So if you're looking at the registration for the seller's block and they just received it a couple of months ago, they're not going to be able to sell that to you until they hit that 1-year mark. So if you are working with a limited time frame for when you need to get the space, that's something you need to keep an eye out for. RIPE is a little bit more lenient with its needs requirements. If you are transferring the space from one RIPE entity to another, there are no needs requirements. If you're doing an inter-RIR transfer from ARIN to RIPE, then you are going to need to show that you can utilize the 50% of the space in the next 5 years. So it's not nearly as stringent of a requirement as ARIN. You can get a little bit larger of a block and get your space through fewer transactions there. APNIC has very similar rules as ARIN, but one thing to keep in mind is that they do have national internet registries. So if you need to get the space into JPNIC, for example, you're going to have to deal with both APNIC and JPNIC and coordinate with all of the parties involved. So you need to figure out that process ahead of time going into it so you don't waste time once the transaction starts. If you are transferring space within ARIN, something that new entrants are always very surprised by is the amount of detail you have to provide ARIN for your 24-month plan. ARIN's going to ask you the details of your connectivity service, the products your organization provides, upstream providers, the addresses you currently have in use, your projected use of the space that's being transferred to you over the next 30 days, 12 months, and 24 months, your network topology, and a list of each logical subnet you plan to create, along with a description of its purpose and outline of the 30-day, 1-year, and 2-year host count for each. This can be quite an undertaking for organizations that haven't been doing a really amazing job of keeping track and planning their networks internally. So you need to have this information ready to go when you go forward with purchasing the addresses, so you don't end up slowing down your transaction and losing out on a deal that you worked hard to set up on. So diligence is an incredibly important aspect of purchasing IP address space. You need to check out the space itself. Check out blacklists and anything else that's relevant to the space that's going to be important to your organization. And make sure you do that before you have a contractual obligation to purchase that space. You can do it in two ways. You can either do the diligence before even entering into the contract, or you can make the contract subject to your successful completion of the diligence and your satisfaction with the space if you're running on a little shorter timeline. One of the most important things to diligence is the seller itself. So the first sort of rule with diligencing the seller is you want to be purchasing the space from the organization that the space is registered to in the RIR. There are a couple of exceptions. If you are purchasing the space from a subsidiary and you're entering into a contract with the parent organization, that's going to be okay, but you're going to want to see evidence of the relationship between those organizations to make sure that that's really in place. Another exception that exists is for bankruptcy estates. You might end up entering into a contract with the trustee, but the space will still be registered to the entity itself. That's going to be fine. You just want to check the court documents to make sure that the trustee has a mandate to sell that particular asset, but that's all publicly recorded information that you can check. And it's also going to give you great rights to the space once it does transfer, because lots of times you can get a court order that gives you rights free and clear of all liens, claims, and encumbrances of other entities. So while it does sometimes take a few more weeks to go through buying space from a bankruptcy estate, sometimes you get the strongest rights when doing that. One thing you need to keep in mind if you are working on a limited timeline is that if the space is registered to an organization that the company you're contracting with purchased several years ago, or if there was some sort of M&A activity that happened in the past, that needs to be updated in Aaron's registry before Aaron's going to allow you to transfer that space to another party. And sometimes that can take anywhere from a week to a month, depending on how much documentation they have of the M&A activity that occurred in the past and how ready they are to present that to Aaron. So if you're working on a limited time frame, make sure that all of that is done ahead of time, or check out your options with other sellers if the seller you're working with still has to go through that process and you're working with a limited time frame. So one issue that has occurred recently is there's been some problems with registration hijacking. So there have been some organizations out there that have been scanning Aaron's database, looking at these legacy resources that are registered to organizations that no longer exist and that haven't been routed for a very long time. They're going out there, they're setting up a new organization by that same name, and then they're making applications to Aaron to be able to take over that space in the hopes of selling it and transferring it to third parties. Aaron's gotten more sophisticated about the way it's been tracking down this sort of activity and is getting a lot better at making sure it's not happening, but there have been a handful of cases where this has successfully gone through, and you don't want to be purchasing space from somebody who has entered into some fraudulent activity and doesn't have the rights to sell it to you in the first place. So one good place to start when looking at the seller to make sure you're not engaging into an agreement with this type of fraudulent entity is you can look at the date that the space is registered to that organization at. So if you look at the Aaron registration, there are going to be two dates on there. There's the registration date and there's the last updated date. If the registration date dates back to prior to the existence of the company that's selling you the space. So say the registration date is 1994, but you're working with a company that's only been around for 2 years. That's an indication that that company received the space via a mergers and acquisitions transfer. And so you're going to want to go back to them and get evidence of the agreements and the M&A activity that occurred that allowed them to successfully complete that 8.2, and make sure you're satisfied with the chain of title documents that they're providing you. Other than that, it's just sort of the same general things you look out for in any type of business agreement that you're doing. Keep an eye out for red flags and research into them. If something's a little concerning. Recently, I saw something where there was some fraudulent activity, and the kid that was selling the space was 18, but all of the documents he was providing to show evidence of the M&A activity, he would have been 12 years old when he signed it. So sometimes it's hard to pinpoint specific things, like a checklist to look for, but just keep an eye out if it's an entity that you haven't worked with before for different red flags, and look into things that may, be a little concerning, and research those, because there are an increasing number of fraudulent actors participating in the market, and you don't want to waste your time and potentially lose money going through that process. Another thing to be cautious of is anybody that comes to you and says, don't worry, I will handle all the details, give me your POC control and I'll take care of everything for you. I recently dealt with someone who had worked with a broker who had told them, don't worry, give me your POC, I'll handle everything. All they saw at the end of the transaction was the errand transfer fee, and they thought that, that was fine. The reality of the situation is, if you are receiving a transfer in errand, you're going to have to provide them with all sorts of documentation showing your need for the space, and you're also going to have officers of your company that are signing and notarizing documents approving the transaction and the sale with errand. So you're not going to just pay an invoice, and you need to be a part of this entire transaction process. Even if you're working with a broker or someone else that's handling a lot of the legwork for you, they should be open with you throughout the process about the different steps that are going on, and you should be at least aware of the process that's going on, and you will be signing these documents. So just be careful of anybody that says, don't worry, I got this, I'll handle everything for you, you don't have to think about it. You do need to think about it, you need to be aware of what's going on. Really the best thing to protect you is to structure your contract in a way that protects you from some of these risks. So use an escrow account or delay payment until after you've received transfer of the space. Don't give somebody the money before the transfer has gone through. At least then, if you are dealing with a fraudulent actor, they don't have your money also. They might have wasted some of your time, but you need to have those structural protections in your contract to keep you from getting too hurt by any fraudulent actors that you may miss out on. So in terms of structuring contracts, there are two really main elements of the contract that you need to think about, and that's the timing of the transfers and the payments. Like I mentioned earlier, you can either do an immediate transfer or you can transfer the space over time via a futures contract. In both cases, you typically use an escrow account. However, when you're doing the futures contract, sometimes the payments are split up in different ways. Sometimes you do a deposit and then you do like a pro rata payment over time. It really depends on the interests of the parties. But when you're working with a counterparty that you're not familiar with, just be very careful about when you're making payments and make sure you have those structural protections in place so that you're not handing over your money before you get what you're paying for. So just in general, some tips for a smooth transfer process. Understand the RIR policies, understand how much space you can qualify to receive, and make a decision about whether you want to just receive the amount that you can qualify for right now, or if you want to pay for a larger amount of space that you can transfer over time in order to save yourself money in the future if prices rise. You need to get your ducks in a row in terms of having all of your justification evidence in place. That can be very, very time consuming, and I've seen some transfers fail and some organizations lose out on a great deal that they had gotten earlier on because it took them 2 months to complete the justification portion of the errand transfer. So get that done ahead of time, and you'll be able to move much more quickly throughout the entire process. Apply for pre-approval. That'll give you the greatest amount of certainty when moving forward with your transfers. And it'll make the transfer process go quicker because they just get to check off a box and say, okay, you have pre-approval and you don't have to go through that again. Structure the contracts to minimize risk. Use an escrow account or delay payment. Don't give someone your money until you have the addresses. And pay attention to your errand online account. It seems like a silly thing, but that's probably the #1 thing that slows down transfers, is that the companies participating just don't check their errand online account as often as they should, and they end up losing a week, even though they have a broker or somebody else involved calling and bugging them. Just keep checking your errand online account and be diligent about that process. Yes, so that's basically the overview of the land. David can give you a totally different perspective from somebody that's participating in the market as a buyer. So let him come up now.
Thank you very much, Amy. I appreciate that. As a reminder for folks, thank you very much. Amy, if you want to come join us, we're going to open the microphone to questions. We have quite a bit of time, so don't be shy. If you have any statements, questions, if you think there's an experience that you want to share that can actually help enrich the conversation. Thank you.
Teddy Vandenberg from SoftLayer. What control has an individual lost due to the marketplace taking up all IP address assignments and sales?
What control has an individual lost?
Right, because the RIRs used to be able to actually dictate how IP addresses were used in the past, and now it's not as much control.
Can you be more specific? Because I don't understand the question. So the RIRs have their policies, right? And later this week, starting tonight, Aaron has their meeting, and we, the community, we set the policies, right? And we all have to live under those policy regimes. There's what we've created. Individuals never had control over that. Corporation, the network operator does. The IP addresses always belong to the operators. Some really old ones belong to, Carl Auerbach or an individual like that. But for the most part, they were always registered to companies, and they were an asset of the company, ignoring the asset stuff. So what kind of control were you looking for?
I guess I was more concerned about smaller corporations not having the same access as the larger corporations.
You mean to the RIR policy development process? Is that what you're?
So small companies, that's where most of the market is, right? Most of the market is in the buying and selling of /24s, and these are with generally smaller entities. And they don't have any different control than a large company might. So I feel like the market works for the sellers and it works for the buyers because we're able to do these transactions. And while we stood up here and we were giving you things to look out for and things you want to be careful of, it really does work. And if you have a /24 that you have control of and is really rightfully you're the registrant of, you can sell it to whomever you want. And I, as a buyer, can buy from whoever I want. And the RIRs aren't in the way of that at all, as far as I can see.
Sure. So I handle a ton of really small sales. I run an auction platform specifically aimed at small buyers and small sellers, where we automate the contract process to get a lot of the hurdles that the big guys have to deal with and all of the lawyers out of the way for these smaller deals. And they still have to go through the ARIN transfer process, and it's a little bit more difficult for them sometimes because they tend not to have as much experience as the operators handling the larger companies, and they haven't gone through the process of getting space directly from ARIN. So sometimes that's an extra hurdle for them to have to deal with, but they can still participate in the policy development process like anybody else can. You can participate on the PPML, you can come to the meetings and talk if you have a problem with the policies and how they're applying to your organization. So I don't see there being a huge difference between the large guys and the small guys, other than the extra hurdle of getting your head around going through the transfer process that you might not have done before.
Okay, thanks.
Middle microphone.
Thank you.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire. Question for you. First, two quick things. The first one is the ARIN Who Was service. It wasn't really mentioned there. Have either of you used that service as a way of looking back at the last 25 years of history related to blocks? Is that within the terms, things like that? Because it was a little ambiguous to me. If, as part of a transfer, a buyer could look at the who was data, if that's allowed in the terms, and if you've used it in the past, I'd really be curious about that.
So I don't believe that's technically allowed under the terms. I've seen who was used for slightly different purposes, and then people that had gotten approval for a slightly different purpose use it for that purpose as well. I'm not sure. I mean, you would probably have a better.
In that vein, I use two tools. As I talked about, I use RIPE RIS because I want to look at the routing history. I want to see which ASs originated routes for the IP addresses I'm buying for as far back as history goes. And RIS goes back decades. It's wonderful. Who was, as you're alluding to, is great because in ARIN, it shows you the registration history at each step, which you can match up to the routing history. So you put those two tools together, and that's a fantastic tool for seeing the big picture of a block.
Thank you. And I guess the second part is a little bit of a statement. Just to be aware that within Aaron, we do have reserved blocks, and there is a policy right now that would lock those up and prevent them being used in part of the transfer market. So it's also very important to know if a block is part of a lockdown. So in TPIA, as an example, you weren't allowed to transfer it for 3 years, but there's no way to necessarily know that without really digging into it.
Yeah, and that's, as buyers, as engineers, as operators, we can't be expected to know every little detail about every RIR's rules and every block's history. And that's where, as Amy was saying in her presentation, it's all about protecting yourself in the terms and conditions. Can you get your money back if something went wrong?
Hi, John Kristoff with DePaul University. 2 brief questions. You can choose who wants to answer this. The first, you mentioned 30% fraud, and I was wondering if there's any additional pattern to that. Like, should I be more leery of fraud occurring with a /16 versus a /24 or not? Or does it not really necessarily matter? Second question is, if I'm a one-man shop and I've got a need for just maybe a couple of /24s, it's a few $100, just based on my quick judgment of what it might cost me, at least just for the address space. Lawyers, that sounds really expensive for just those 2 small, relatively assets. Do you still recommend going through an elaborate lawyer process, or how involved do I need to get legal representation? I know you're not a lawyer, but what might I expect for legal representation, even for relatively small purchases in that space?
All right, so your first question was about the fraud in big versus small. Amy?
Sure. So I'd say for the most part with the very large blocks, I see a little bit less fraud, especially if it comes from a /8 holder, because there are pretty clear records there, and the holders of very large amounts of space tend to be very large organizations where you can do a bit more diligence with. I see more fraud going on with the smaller blocks, especially smaller than a /16. I'd say once you get /20 and smaller, you see quite a bit more. So you just need to be careful about who you're dealing with. Make sure that you get chain of title history where it's there, and just make sure you use escrow and other ways to make sure your funds don't go over ahead of time. And as far so with the really small sales, I don't use lawyers. I don't really see a lot of organizations using lawyers with the really small sales, just because the dollar amount is so low that it's just not reasonable for them to do so. Whatever money they would lose from doing that is typically less than the cost of attorneys being involved in that. Again, just use escrow.
Yeah, it's about your tolerance for risk. No one here is going to tell you when to use and when not to use a lawyer. That's up to you. But it's what's your tolerance for risk. At $15 an IP address, it's over $4,000 for a /24. Does that $4,000 plus the time you put in, does that mean a lot to you? If it does, then you spend a little bit more and protect yourself more. If it's negligible, then you are open to more risk. This, in the very small, in the scenario you've outlined, this is where brokers and exchange operators are very, very helpful, because their interest isn't just moving, right? Volume, and they want a successful market because it's good for their business. This is where they can really be a help. For the small /24 transfers, once you've agreed on price and you're okay with the price you're paying, your brokers and exchange operators have done this. They've iterated it over and over, and I'm feel pretty confident saying you're probably in good hands if you've picked a good broker or exchange.
Sure, and our reputations are at stake with these too, because we do so many of these. It's not like this is a one-time deal where we're in and out. So we do have quite a bit of vetting that goes on before we even engage a seller, because we would hate to be in a situation where we perpetuated some sort of fraudulent activity, because our reputation is tied to what we're doing here.
I had a statement and a question. We're using my own mic. Donnie Roisman with SoftLayer. Just 2 statements I want to echo a bit. One statement I want to echo a bit. The value of brokers or exchange operators is definitely huge. These are experts in the market. Many companies maybe would complete 1, 2, 3 transactions over a multi-year period. These exchange operators and brokers are moving a multiple per month, so they're really you're tapping into a good resource there. One recommendation I would make is if you are being solicited by a broker and exchange operator, which you have never bumped into at a NANOG or an Aaron or a RIPE or an APNIC, delete the email, hang up the phone. You really want to be working with people who are active in the space, who know the business, know the industry, and know the players in the space. So I would say your best bet is look at one of these conferences and talk to the brokers that you can actually see in person that you've seen coming back again and again. One question I had is, you'd mentioned, David, in your slide that there are some cases where you might be speaking to a seller and they'll say, well, I have 90% ready now and the rest of the 10% might be ready in the future. What would be your advice or recommendation if you find yourself in that position?
So, I mean, it depends on your situation. If you don't need that 10%, it's a good transaction, it's a qualified seller, it's someone you're comfortable doing business with, the price is right, go for it. You structure the terms and conditions of the contract to ensure that there are penalties or there are motivations for them to follow through and deliver future tranches as they're clean. You follow up, engineer to engineer. People generally act in good faith if you found a good buyer, and if you're a qualified seller, people are they're just trying to do business, right? So it's increasingly common, as far as I can tell, that you're not going to get all the space right away. So you have to be flexible, and you have to be flexible in your terms. And you have to understand the seller's trying to make a sale, so you need to work with them and put yourself in their shoes and say, well, what would you do? And go with it.
I would just sort of preface that by saying that's very much true for large sales. If you're looking at buying a /16 or smaller and the entity you're working with can't get off of the space all at once, keep looking. There's a ton more space out there, especially if it's less than a 16. So that's really that's a large buyer problem.
It's Vince Cerf from Google. A couple of questions. First one is there any kind of a reputation system that would help someone figure out if they are speaking to a reputable broker or agent?
Not that I'm aware of.
There's no gossip sheet somewhere.
So
Okay.
you can become a registered facilitator with the RIRs that have transfer policies in place. Although when we signed up, I'm pretty sure we just had to sign a document and pay $500. I'm not sure. There wasn't a ton of vetting going on there.
Yeah, it's a very young market, and the opaqueness sometimes works against us.
Yeah, I would say maybe ask for references and look at the types of organizations that they're giving you references from. Are they organizations that you've heard of?
So the second observation is when I hear terms like purchase and asset, that makes me nervous. Some of you will have watched the IANA transition debates and actions that were taking place very close to the transition point. An argument was being made that an asset of the government was being transferred. This is not helpful. I gather it's almost impossible to stop, but we have the same problem with domain names. People speak as if they own them, but they really only have a license to use. I noticed that you were careful to say that Aaron refers to license. There are good reasons for that, to protect the whole system. But I gather that our friends outside the U.S. don't have the same litigious concerns that we do.
Yeah, I'll share something with the audience. John Curran, the CEO of Aaron, has been very loud and upfront over the last year and a half that IP addresses are not an asset as far as Aaron is concerned. They are a license. And this didn't sit all that well with me. So the company I work for is spending a lot of money. So I wanted to make sure we got it right. So we invested some money and some time in a lot of lawyers to do months of research and really look at this. And in the United States, and under US law, we came to the conclusion that Aaron's position, that Vint has expressed very well, is 100% backed up by the law. These are not yours, these are not assets. And that's where you gotta be really careful in that first paragraph of that contract, that asset purchase agreement. It's not yours. You're gonna use it, you're basically gonna think about it like yours, because they're on a network and hopefully they're gonna be there for decades, but it's not an asset. And Vint is saying software is starting to turn into that as well. So, look,
just a minor language point, there's a difference between an asset and property. So you can have a contract right that is an asset, but it doesn't mean you own it like property. But I think that what we're getting at here is the property question. And in North America, they treat it as a contract, right? But there are all sorts of contract rights that you can buy and sell. That doesn't make it your property. It just means you're assuming somebody else's position within that contract. But it's still, an asset of your organization.
Kevin?
Kevin Bloomberg. So thankfully, Vint brought up the regulation of brokers where there really isn't any. And just to add to the concern, I have seen brokers at multiple conferences, Aaron and NANOG, and Barnum and Bailey would be proud. Just because you've seen them in the halls, the stuff that they're selling is ridiculous. So what I'd actually like to ask each one of you is, can you sort of point out the best, not even, fraudulent's the wrong word, the biggest exaggeration, the biggest crap you have seen from pseudo brokers in our industry, something that really stood out? And I'll actually start with you. My favorite was the broker who tested his seller's space, and in doing so got it listed on every blacklist out there and made it unsaleable. That's stupidity, not malicious, but stupidity. So do you have any good stories in that regard?
I recently had a fun fraud case. I'm helping somebody get some space back that was fraudulently taken from them. There was another broker. I'm still working out the details. I'm not going to assign any blame or name any names, but it looks like there was a broker that was involved with submitting some fraudulent documentation that included a notarized signature from somebody that had been dead for 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. The stories I could tell. I spent 10 years at Aaron fighting fraud. I've seen a lot of it. When I had a broker this week offer a tranche of a /12 to me for $15, an IP address, which it's an opening number. It's fine. It's not that irregular today. And they said, but I have a different seller who has 40 different blocks that together comprise almost a /12, and he's willing to sell them to you for $9. Gosh, why do you think that is? Why, when a broker comes to you and has two what they think of as equivalent block sizes and two completely different prices, one of which is completely below market, you got to ask yourself why. And that really, I looked at that email from the broker, and he and I have known each other a long time, so email's fine. And I said, why, this guy doesn't get it. This guy doesn't realize that when you're dealing with these people who are just scamming for bucks, you're not helping anybody.
Although one thing I'll say in defense of brokers that'll give you two different prices, sometimes we do have clients that have different timing requirements, especially if you're working with like a bankruptcy estate or something where there's a limited time period where they need to get those funds in. Sometimes they can provide you with a credible backstory of why one seller might be willing to sell for below market value.
But you're probably upfront about that.
Yeah. They should tell you about that, right? And if they don't ask about it, make sure it makes sense.
Yeah, that's one of those.
Because sometimes there are realistic stories for why something is priced at below market.
Yeah. I see someone at the microphone.
John Curran, CEO, Aaron. If you're, there's a lot of reputable, useful brokers out there. If you're a emerging, creative broker who's attempting to make a quick money by getting people to send it to you, don't start off by putting an offer together to sell an IP address block that's not registered to you and then spamming me with your offer. That's not productive.
Hey, Donnie?
There we go. Thank you very much, Amy and David. That was wonderful. Very good talk. It's my pleasure.